everyone. I'm Leanne West, and I'm the president of the International Children's Advisory Network. And I want to welcome you today to Ask the Experts, where sometimes the experts are clinicians and sometimes the experts are our youth members. I'm Leanne, I'm president of iCAN, and we have Anthony Chang here today to talk about clinical trials and maybe terminology in clinical trials, or just if you have questions in general about clinical trials. And then you're always welcome to ask something off topic as well, if you'd like. So yeah, maybe we just get started. Anthony?
Hi, everybody. Good morning on a Saturday. Well, just give you a little bit of my background in the clinical research area. I'm a practicing pediatric cardiologist. I've always done research throughout my career. I was lucky to have started it pretty early, even as a medical student, well, actually a college student doing research. I was at Johns Hopkins, and as you know, or may not know, they're really big on molecular biology research. So I was a molecular biology major. And as part of a work study program, I did research at the Cancer Research Institute right by the campus. So that was a good experience. And then that led to just an interest in doing research, answering questions that people might have. So I think, getting an early start helps to have that mindset to make a contribution in knowledge. As one of my mentors said, there's some people that quote papers and then other people that write papers. So it's always good to be the ones to write papers, because I think people shouldn't feel like just because they can quote a paper that they're they're smarter than anyone else, but you should make a contribution as well. It's sort of a less self-centered way to make a contribution. And then I was lucky enough to end up on the NIH Pediatric Grant Review Committee for a couple of decades, working with really people that are much smarter than I was in terms of doing clinical research, and learned a lot. Since I was the only cardiologist on the team, it was good to just kind of frame everything from a cardiology perspective, and have continued to do clinical research and trying to change how we do clinical research in a way, because I think it's still too hard to do clinical research. It's almost as if you just had a question about something, in 2021, we should be able to find ways to answer that question very quickly without setting up an Excel spreadsheet, which is clinical research that I was doing most of my career. I think in 2021, things are available for you to do clinical research without an Excel spreadsheet. So with that, I can answer any questions that people might have.
So a question that came up, and I'll kick off the questions that we've had lately, is kids want to know a little bit more about clinical research, and they've been asking, how do they find out about it? There's not a great sense of where to go or how to get started or who's even eligible. So I think those introductory questions would probably be helpful.
I have a question.
Okay, Juliana, okay.
When you're working in the lab, are you figuring out vaccines for COVID?
I'm not in the lab any longer. I used to be in the lab, in the molecular biology lab, and I'm sure that lab would have been involved partly. As you may or may not know, when the pandemic started affecting our country, a lot of labs just kind of dropped what they were doing and working towards the vaccine, which was a good thing. And all the scientists had that as their first priority, or a lot of them did anyway. So I'm not doing molecular biology bench research anymore. So there's bench research and clinical research. So when people say basic science or bench research, they're talking about going to the lab, like you're saying, and doing experiments. My area of research when I was an undergraduate student was cancer research. So I was what they call harvest, or just get white cells. So I had the unenviable task of putting mice into a plastic bag and trying to kindly sacrifice them, and then so we can get the spleens for research for white cells. Some of you may not want to do that at all, and there are plenty of research, bench research projects that don't require sacrificing animals. So you have to decide if you're willing to do that or not. My lab partner, when I was younger, certainly was very squeamish about that. And she always asked me to do it. She just did the other part. But it's hard to do some of this research without sacrificing animals. And when I was doing basic science research, we had to sacrifice anything from a mouse to a piglet to rabbits. So, and of course it bothered me, but of course you also have to weigh that against advancing knowledge for people. So that kind of justified it, but you have to decide if you're willing to do that. The nice thing about clinical research is once you get permission from patients and families, it doesn't require any of the issues that you have with, animal or bench research. And it's just as satisfying to answer a question that you have, from looking at studying patients in general. So both types of research, basic science research and clinical research are, I think in my mind, equally satisfying. It just satisfies you in different ways. Some people still do both. It's hard to do both, but some people still do both.
What are you doing right now?
What's research I'm doing right now?
Yes.
I'm kind of doing research in the artificial intelligence area. So trying to change in some ways how we do clinical research, because before I was part of the paradigm or the thinking that you do clinical research by setting up your Excel spreadsheet and you get all the patient data filled into that spreadsheet and you dig up paper charts. And I think we've come a long ways from that. So one of the research, it's actually research on research. So one of the things I'm doing is trying to advance data, how we store data and how we look at data in such a way that my dream is that any clinician could just ask a question and it could be within minutes and hours, that question could be answered rather than weeks, months, and even years sometimes. Because I think as the pandemic has shown us, right, it would have been nice to have very good information very quickly, and we waited a long time for a lot of the information to come through. I have a ton of respect for human-driven randomized controlled trials, but I think as the years go by in the future, I think we're going to realize that sort of data-driven clinical research is in some cases faster and more actionable, items can come out of that kind of research. So one of my research areas is kind of researching the research. So and what I call agile clinical research, agile meaning fast and nimble. So what my team does, I have a data scientist team. So that know kind of basics of artificial intelligence. So what we do is figure out a way to do clinical research without Excel spreadsheets and without involving a lot of people. Just kind of like a nimble way of doing clinical research to answer questions. So in a way, it's kind of cool to not have to rely on a lot of people and Excel spreadsheets to do research, because with electronic records now, they're so available. You can just write a program and that program can look for answers in the data if it's complete and if it's accurate. Those are the two caveats. The data has to be good and much faster than research assistants looking for information to fill in the Excel spreadsheet. So it's kind of a faster, more modern way of doing clinical research. And for instance, a really cool project we're doing now is, you know how in kids there are a lot of rare diagnoses, and we often underdiagnose or miss the diagnosis altogether. And my feeling was, now with electronic records now available, why don't we just look for it proactively? So we're setting up a cool project that we have certain rare diseases that have certain symptoms and signs that are very almost unique to that rare disease. And we can write a program that will look for those keywords or phrases. And we just set this little, I call it a little research robot. So that this little research robot can go through hundreds of thousands of medical records and actually look for this rare diagnosis. And we actually, I don't know if I can show you a cool thing that we found just yesterday even. Maybe I'll try to do it as we're talking, where you can actually find a kid with a rare diagnosis. And it's kind of cool that we can do that. Let me see if I can get that up for you.
And while you look for that, Anthony,
Yeah.
I thought maybe we could talk about what kind of data you're talking about. So it could be the age of the child, the diagnosis of the child, the ethnicity of the child, temperature, or whatever it might be. There's all sorts of information about you that they can look at and help understand, what your condition is and maybe how you would best respond to treatment.
Just to jump in from the chat, I wanted to draw attention to Juliana's comment. She would like to have her life back. So this is helpful for her to hear all the positive things that are happening. And Karen jumped in and said, do you call all of this bioinformatics? So maybe you could expand on that too.
Oh, great questions. You guys know a lot already. So bioinformatics, I call it the other I, other than intelligence, which is my area. The bioinformatics is really important because that gives you good data and good information so that you can do even more sophisticated analytics on top of that. So informatics, I'm also educated in informatics. So I think it's hard to do AI or artificial intelligence projects in a hospital or health system without any real foundational knowledge in informatics. So, but some people do it. Some people do AI. My data scientists are not trained in informatics, but in a way they are getting trained through me because they have a lot of questions about how to set up data and how to look for data. So I think yes, it's intimately coupled to artificial intelligence. So I call it the two I's. So you have informatics, and with informatics, you have artificial intelligence. And think of this as a pyramid from data to information to knowledge, and then artificial intelligence on top. And then at the very, very top, I say it's human wisdom, because wisdom is still the most important thing and often needed in clinical medicine. So I just want to show you this cool little, this is pre-publication, so you have information that's literally right off of our research right now. So behind my head is a clinical finding. And then, so you have three big clusters. Here's one big cluster. Here's another big cluster here. And a third cluster here, down here. And then you see between two clusters, we have a smaller cluster, right there, between these two, right? So what we've done is we took three things that would give us a diagnosis of something called Barth syndrome, which is a really rare diagnosis, but rare because we probably under or misdiagnose it for other things. So the Barth syndrome children have three things. They have neutropenia, or low white cells. They have dilated cardiomyopathy, and that's why often I'm involved as a cardiologist. And they have weakness, or neuromuscular weakness. So, so behind my head is neutropenia. I think this other one here, I'm trying to do this. This one here, I think is dilated cardiomyopathy. And below here is dilated cardiomyopathy is weakness of the heart muscle, in case you don't know. And right here is weakness. So for instance, these patients here, between these two big clusters, the smaller cluster are patients with both dilated cardiomyopathy or heart muscle disease and weakness. So these are the patients. So you can see that what we want is patients that have all three of these. So you see this tiny little one dot here? This is an undiagnosed patient that we're able to discover. As far as I know, we're double checking, but this patient has not been diagnosed with Barr syndrome. We just happen to find, it's sort of like the single dot between these two sets of clusters is what we're looking for right there. That tiny little dot is one patient that probably still doesn't know that he or she has Barr syndrome. So it's kind of so we want to set up thousands of these so that we can go look. It's kind of like, reminds me of the show, is it the Treasure Hunters or something, where you kind of look for treasure, except in this case is looking for the treasure of making a diagnosis, which is very valuable. Some of these parents that have gone for years or even decades looking for their kids' diagnosis. And I sponsor meetings on artificial intelligence, and one of the guests I've had, and maybe Leanne and Amy remember, was a patient that went on for 8 years without a diagnosis. And the mom had 2 beach bags full of medical records that she carries to each clinical specialist every time there's a new one, and trying to make sense out of this. And I simply said, you know, your child has X, Y, and Z. It's kind of unusual to have all 3. I'm almost sure there's a genetic component to this. One, I sent you to the genetic specialist, and our geneticists are very good here in Orange County, and they were able to say, we need to test for these things. And then sure enough, he had a really rare diagnosis. Again, rare because we probably don't successfully diagnose a lot of the kids in time for these things. So the takeaway here is that, you know, there are a lot of people and children with undiagnosed disorders, and it's a wonderful area to do research. So this is kind of like not your typical clinical research in terms of answering a question that one of your clinicians might have by, you know, filling in data on Excel spreadsheets. So this is a more, I think, data science driven way of doing research, but making a contribution. So an important aspect of this is you're making a contribution in a different way.
How many years have you worked on that part of
this project here that I'm showing you? This we just started doing about a month ago. We're just setting up a sort of a strategy to do this. We still need a clever name for this project, but it's kind of like, it just reminds me of a little bot that goes around and look for things that it can discover. So years from when we saw, I was suspecting that we might have one or more dots right in the middle, which means the patient has all 3 areas. So it was really like, I was really excited to see that one. That means we can help that patient, you know? So yeah, it's another way of doing clinical research. Other clinical research I'm doing mainly around artificial intelligence. So it's a little, you don't see too many clinicians doing research in that area, but I think increasingly you will find more and more clinicians use sort of artificial intelligence in their clinical research. So it's a very exciting time for those of you who are going into medicine, because there'll be more tools available for you than certainly for me when I was at your stage in interest in going into medicine. So I'm almost a little jealous that you have all these things available now. And I'm also involved in setting up a curriculum or a coursework for a new medical school. And the ask for me was set up the curriculum of the future for the future clinician. And so I'm very excited about that project, because I think we would do so many things differently than how I was trained and educated.
How long have you been working here?
At Children's Hospital Orange County? Where I am now?
Yes.
Hard to believe, but I'm finishing my 16th year. So I've been here for a long time. Yeah.
That's amazing, actually. Where else have you worked?
I've been very fortunate. It's almost like I was just blessed with a storybook career. I started off at Johns Hopkins, as I mentioned, and I went to DC to get pediatrics training at Children's National. And then I went into Children's Hospital of Philadelphia for my cardiology training. And then I went to Boston Children's to do more training. I don't want to scare anybody, but I did a lot of years of training. And then I stayed on Boston Children's. And then I moved to Texas Children's, Miami Children's, Children's Hospital Los Angeles, and finally ended up here at Children's Hospital Orange County. So one good thing about moving around is that you kind of learn from everybody at that place, and you kind of take it with you when you leave. So I tend to recommend for people not to stay somewhere for like 30, 40, 50 years, which some people do. I just think it's kind of nice to get new insight. Karen is agreeing or not agreeing. I think it's almost like you don't want your kids living with the parents for like 30, 40 years, because it's kind of nice to go out, look around. If you don't want to move from your home institution just because it's such a great match, then at least do little sabbaticals elsewhere so you can see how other people think. It just makes you a much smarter person, I think, overall, when you see. They're definitely cardiologists much smarter than I am, but the fact that I've been to Texas Children's and Boston Children's, Philadelphia Children's, just kind of soak in everyone else's wisdom makes you smarter at the end, that you kind of taken in all of their good ideas and take them with you, right? Because it's one thing to learn something where you are, but if you don't take it with you, then you're really not making a contribution. So a lot of the, in artificial intelligence speak, it's called transfer learning. So you take one body of knowledge and you kind of implant it into some other situation. In my case, as a human cardiologist, I take everything I learned from Philadelphia Children's and took it to Boston Children's. And it was kind of nice because Boston Children's at the time was pretty inbred. Like a lot of people just kind of stayed on and didn't move to other places or came from other places. So when I went to Boston Children's as a cardiologist, I was the first person in like 10 or 12 years that came from the outside. And I think everyone agrees now that's just not the best for the program. While you like to keep people that are good and you trust, you sometimes have to take a little risk and take people from the outside because they can make a contribution in a very different way. Looks like there's a lot of questions now. We kind of got, okay. Which question do we take?
I think the next one is, do you ever use augmented reality or virtual reality in some of the work? Field?
So funny you should ask that, because I'm really getting deeper and deeper in that area. That's from Karen. Hi, Karen. Right now, as you know, we have virtual reality, which is creating a visual experience that is detached from what you see or reality. And then there's augmented reality, which is building layers of visual elements on top of your home, your own environment. And then there's a hybrid reality or mixed reality, which is elements of both. So right now the visual experience is good, but it doesn't really have what I call an intelligence component to it or an AI component to it. So one of my research areas now is to think of ways to educate and train people in healthcare with a artificial intelligence layer to it, so that you can self-train and self-educate in a fun way. It's almost like gaming the educational training clinical experience. And we actually just launched our first project, looking at a resuscitation scheme that doesn't require a mentor there all the time and doesn't require anything more than just access to this software. So I call this intelligent reality rather than just extended reality. So that's a really good area right now, because especially with on-site training up in the air right now that we're setting up a resuscitation algorithm that's built into the visual experience so that people on their own can train on their own to overcome a clinical situation. So that's a very exciting area for us right now. So it's almost like AI with another emergent technology can give you a really cool sort of hybrid technology that hasn't been available. I wish I was trained as a molecular biologist. I wish we had some of the tools that we have now. When I was getting trained, trying to picture these things in your head is very difficult. And I think people are taking advantage of that right now with a lot of the software and AI that's available to design vaccines. For instance, the vaccine design had a good component of AI behind it to figure out what proteins might look like just based on the sequence. And we're making a lot of headway in artificial intelligence being able to do that.
We have one from Olivia.
Yeah.
I've been watching Grey's Anatomy lately. I'm curious to know how you feel about that show and if you think it's realistic or not.
I would say it's a good comedy for me. It's kind of like I have some really good lawyer friends, and they think shows on TV about lawyers is totally just off target. I think the same for medicine. There are very, very few shows about medicine that I think have really kind of nailed it. Unfortunately, none of them are from recently. Even House, which is often called, a really realistic medical show, I think it's far from that. One of the episodes I remember was, House, Dr. House is part of a group of sort of clinical investigators. I think they're pathologists by their trade, by their subspecialty, right? So one of his younger colleagues was looking at a child with a heart disease. And I think it was Kawasaki disease, which is a heart disease that afflicts younger children, and they have coronary artery problems. So all of a sudden I'm watching this show. I said, I don't think they're going to get this right. So they decided to take this kid to the cath lab, which we almost never do with Kawasaki children. And then his younger colleague is a pathologist, and he's doing the heart catheterization. I'm like, that just deflated me in terms of any expectation from the show, because those are two big misses. We don't typically do heart catheterizations on Kawasaki children. And then on top of that, we wouldn't have a pathologist doing the heart catheterization because a pediatric cardiologist would be doing the heart catheterization. So it was just such a big miss, 2 in a row. I just lost off. I think the show has good acting, but I just kind of lost faith in it. I mean, I watch it for comic relief, basically. But I would say at least House was like, from a scale from 1 to 10, I would say House was more like a 5. I mean, had some realistic clinical diagnosis. I'm sorry? The show House, I would say from 1 to 10, 10 being like very realistic, almost like a documentary. I would say House is like right in the middle, like a 5. Grey's Anatomy is more like a 3 or a 2 even some days. It's more about the human relationships. And I think even the human relationship aspect are just not very realistic in a hospital setting. I have to tell you a funny little story. When I was working at Children's Hospital of Los Angeles, because I was doing cardiology and intensive care. Do you remember the show ER? It was pretty popular back then in the 90s. So because I was in LA, they called the hospital looking for someone that knows cardiology and knows ER or intensive care, and they called me. So it was kind of funny that I'm in the middle of the ICU. I'm answering this call from the studio looking for an expert in this area, and I just thought it would be an interesting experience. So I decided to join this group of medical consultants for the show ER. And so they called me, and we had back then it was just phone conferences. So they called me and they said, we have this scenario. So Clooney's going to come in. No, he was a doctor in the ER. Clooney's going to come in and the kid's going to be in trouble with, and they said something with really fast heart rate. I think it's called SVT. Yeah. I said, yeah, we know that disease well, heart condition well. And well, then he's going to shock this kid. And I said, well, back then it was like 1997 or something. I said, we don't shock kids anymore with this diagnosis. We just put in an IV because they're almost always stable. And we just push a medication called adenosine, which is available then. And then they say, well, that doesn't sound like very dramatic. I said, well, we just don't shock. I said, if we have this medical condition on the show and you're shocking this kid, then the clinicians watching the show are going to say, this is not very realistic. And then they say, okay, so let's think of something else. And they came back and said, how about we found out there's this heart condition called myocarditis. I say, yes, it's not rare. It happens in the emergency room. How about if we shock that kid? It's like, I said, well, oftentimes we just stabilize them. They're not in ventricular tachycardia. You can put that kid in ventricular tachycardia, but, and then they wouldn't have this kid intubated, right? They want to see the face without the endotracheal tube. I said, if we're shocking this kid's going to be intubated, 99.9% of the time. And then the third time they called me and said, Dr. Chang, we don't think this is going to be a good fit for us. So I basically got fired from the show ER. Well, let go. I should say let go. Because I was too honest about these scenarios. They wanted a doctor just to give them very dramatic scenarios with George Clooney. So I guess I could have met George Clooney. I gave that up for honesty. So so anyway, so yeah, so I don't, even ER is not too realistic. I would say if you can find this TV series that if you want to really know what medicine could be like or will be like, I think one of the shows that I remember is something called, was it St. Elmo's Fire? Or no, not St. Elmo's Fire, St. Elsewhere. I'm sorry, St. Elsewhere. St. Elsewhere. You can probably still find it on Amazon. That, I think that was as realistic a medical show as I've ever seen, St. Elsewhere. And it's funny too. I mean, it's very funny. It's very real. Very few times I would say, did they portray something that I felt like was far-fetched. I was still in training at the time, and I felt like it was so almost comforting to come home and watch a show about medicine, but in a funny context, because my training was pretty vigorous. So yeah, there are very, very few medical shows that are realistic, but at least that gives you a window into what life might be like as a clinician. So, but don't take everything on the show for too seriously, because a lot of things aren't the way they portrayed it. I don't know, Karen, are you a clinician or a researcher or both?
Definitely a researcher, but also a practitioner. I have my own consulting practice. So I actually work across industries, issues, communities, and cultures.
Yeah.
And my official program, my academic program, my graduate work was at the Harvard Graduate School of Education program called Risk and Prevention, which looks at systems and how those systems interact and how that impacts risk and resiliency for youth, families, and communities.
Oh, wonderful.
And I also work in innovation spaces. So I'm deeply inside of many areas of innovation, from concept to market. So I got to sit a couple of years ago, a number of years ago. I'm right now in New Jersey, but I was full-time in Boston for 15 years, still have a hub there. I got to sit in on a all-day symposium at Beth Israel that brought engineers and AI and robotics people and engineers together. So they were showcasing all these different technologies, some for young people, and young people has been also a part of my work for forever. So I'm lucky to discover iCAN. It's such a wonderful, wonderful thing.
also love to recruit you at some point to be part of iSpy, which is a sister organization.
Yeah, I got to
Yeah.
sit in on it, actually.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
where I learned how the iPhone, the last time I went, the iPhone creates havoc for pacemakers, I learned.
They can, yeah.
I learned that. I started
yeah.
sharing that with people, and I got to go to the eShip.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
can I ask one question that was up in, I don't, just about what's the hardest thing when you were doing clinical research, like at the bench, you know, with around humans? What's the hardest part of that, and what's the most gratifying part for you?
Oh, what a great question. I think there's so many positive things. There's so few negative things. I think the hardest thing might be just being patient to recruit patients and families. But in pediatrics, I can remember the number of times that parents said no to my clinical research request for permission on one hand with fingers left over. It's so rare for a parent to say no. And I just pay tribute to all the parents out there and families that were so amazingly collaborative about a researcher, because I was a cardiologist and a researcher, to come to them and ask for permission to do sometimes interventions or procedures that may have a small risk to their child and not always direct benefit immediately, you know, maybe later on. And I was always amazed how many parents would just say, you know, we trust you and we want you to get information to help, you know, our child and other children, and just this amazing, extreme trust in clinical researchers. But I would say it's just the tediousness of, you know, going to families, getting permission, getting all the records entered into the Excel spreadsheet. So it's the mechanical things that were, I think, the only main negative thing, but everything else was just amazing and gratifying to add a piece of knowledge to overall clinical knowledge was just immensely satisfying for me. And I'm still hooked to this day, as you can see, but trying to approach it from a different way. I think perhaps another negative thing is how many people are stuck on doing things the old way in clinical medicine and still think they're not as open as I like to see for other ways of doing clinical research. But I think a few and some clinical researchers are coming around to say, you know, it's 2021, we can look at data and information a little bit differently than always multi-centered randomized clinical trials as the only answer. Yeah, we need something faster and better and more accurate. I think this pandemic, in a way, I always say it took a pandemic for us to look at things differently. It took a pandemic for us to realize randomized controlled trials, multi-center for a pandemic was not a good fit. You know, it took too long to get very actionable intelligence out to the field. It just took too long. You may remember that it took 3 or 4 months before we realized that putting patients prone for them to oxygenate was just as good a practice, if not better, than ventilating them on a mechanical ventilator. It took 3 or 4 months. That should have been in days. We should have figured out that that was a better way. So unfortunately, a lot of people lost their lives just because we hadn't really figured that out. But if there's a way that ICU doctors from pediatrics and adults could have mingled and could have shared thoughts and could have done quick clinical research, we would have found out pretty early that this was a good therapy. So yeah, not too many negative things about clinical research, but maybe just sometimes the logistics are very tedious and you have to fill out a lot of paperwork. Oh, I know what's a slight negative for me is the IRB process.
Oh, right.
Trying to write grants and trying to write your internal research board application and paperwork is sometimes pretty daunting, but you know, if you're so passionate about research, that's just inconvenient rather than a deal breaker, I think so. How about for you, Karen?
Oh, just one other quick question. There's a lot of things that are wonderfully inspiring and challenging in the way that I work. but there's also incredible fruits too. I cross-pollinate in the bigger picture, but I also work, believe it or not, in film and TV and radio. And
Okay.
so I get what you were talking about, but I'm not a gamer myself.
Yeah.
But I do think that there is great potential to use it as not only as a tool in what you're doing, excuse me, but also as a tool for educating the next generation.
Yeah.
To train people who are, using technology, who are digital natives. And like there's a program at Harvard Graduate School of Education called Technology, Innovation, and Education. And to partner with, I think this would be a really cool thing for iCAN conference.
Yeah.
To bring gamers together, to partner and create new games for the pedagogy of understanding this stuff. As well as using it in AR, VR, and robotics and all that stuff, but actually the pedagogy, the training of next generations, where you could create interesting games and fun games to help people understand even the innovation part, right? And what it takes to bring an innovation to market.
Yeah.
So anyway, we could talk about it. I'd love to chat with you.
Yeah. I think you're very similar to me in how I look at innovation and using AI. Despite my failure with Hollywood earlier on, I actually do have a few close friends who are film producers, and I'm actually making a video series on artificial intelligence that will be much more friendly for clinicians than what you see on the internet right now. So, but yeah, I'm a big believer in what you believe in, which is using other ways non-conventional ways of teaching and using more, modern technology that's available for sure. Yeah. I think I could have explained like this. This is essentially something called a graph database and knowledge graph to find patients. I could have described it with text slides, but as soon as I show this to my team, other team members, they kind of got it right away, so that's just the power of a visual representation of something that you're trying to describe. So when I give talks, there are hardly any words on my slides. So yes, was it Sebastian that had a question, or Juliana?
What is your easiest and hardest operation that you ever did?
I'm a cardiologist. I do some procedures. I don't do them anymore. But I would say the hardest procedure is some ways the easiest procedure, but the most risk. So that makes it hard. There's something called a balloon septostomy, which is, it sounds technical, but what we do is in certain congenital heart diseases, we actually put a catheter into the heart and we blow up a little balloon, like 3 to 5 cc's worth of a balloon, and we pull it across the upper chambers of the heart. There's a wall that separates the two upper chambers of the heart, and we kind of intentionally want to create a hole between those two upper chambers by basically jerking this catheter with a balloon tip at the end across the septum or the wall between the two upper chambers. It really sounds terrible, and it feels terrible when you do it. You can almost feel the tissue kind of tear when you pulling that catheter across, but also gives you it's a life-saving procedure in some situations, and it is so satisfying. I remember I couldn't sleep the first night that I did one of these procedures. It was just so exciting that you saved the baby's life doing that procedure. But it is very risky. I've seen babies die from that procedure. It's a very risky procedure, but it's a life-saving procedure when you have to do it. And unfortunately, oftentimes it's in the middle of the night. See, things like this should have been on ER, but it's never on ER or house. You often have to go in the middle of the night, and the baby's in trouble with the oxygen level in the 30s and 40s, which you never see in adults until the pandemic. Of course, some adult patients did go to that low level, and then you do the procedure, and the baby oxygen level comes up to the 80s and 90s almost right away. It's so dramatic and so satisfying as a cardiologist to be able to do that procedure. So that's probably the most difficult procedure because it's so risky and so it's almost always an emergency procedure. So that creates a lot of stress for the cardiologist. And you're often surrounded by like 25, 30 people because they all want to see this procedure. So that doesn't help the stress level when you're trying to do the procedure. But I still have, believe it or not, I did my first, it's called a Rashkind procedure after Dr. Rashkind, who was one of my mentors actually. I still have the catheter from my first one when I was a fellow, doing it as an emergency. I still have it, you know, in the basement somewhere. I saved that catheter, you know, gosh, that was like 1987 that I did the procedure. So that's almost 40 years ago. I still have that catheter. that meant the world to me. It's kind of like you're kind of officially a cardiologist when you do one of those procedures. I think you guys are asking amazingly good questions. The easiest procedure, I guess the easiest procedure would be just a peripheral IV that you put in a kid. That's technically a procedure. There probably shouldn't be the mindset that you have easy procedures, because I think that's when you let your guard down and a complication can happen. So, but these are great questions. I love these sessions because our young people, our young friends ask amazingly good questions that I don't get from adults. Can you share a link? Okay. On what? Okay.
So we mentioned KidsX in the chat. Someone had a question about video game, or a comment I think that Karen made about video games.
Yeah.
And iCAN should look into that. And so we have our kids test video games when they come to us, which is always more fun than an assent or a consent.
Yeah.
And we've partnered with KidsX, which I know you know, Anthony.
Yeah.
And they're all about doing startup companies who have video game technologies or app technologies for kids to help them with their conditions.
Yeah.
So that's another fun activity that our kids can do is give feedback on those devices and games and things.
Yeah. I'm hoping in being part of this group that will be designing the medical school of the future, basically, that we will have a lot of components of this visual learning that wasn't really available. I mean, there are even anatomy labs now. You can do visual dissections without a cadaver. So the debate is that good or not good for the future doctor to not have done a cadaver in their anatomy lab? I think we should take the best of both worlds. I would still think a more three-dimensional tactile experience and dissecting a cadaver was very helpful for me. On the other hand, you can probably review things without, when I was a medical student, we used to have to go up to the cadaver lab sometimes Friday and Saturday nights, a little bit creepy up there to be by yourself with 100 dead bodies around you. And we often play jokes on each other, right? So we often will have a leg drop from the table, but not the cadaver's leg. We would respect the body, but people would get spooked hearing noises or seeing things move in the lab. And we used to play jokes on each other doing that. But I think there's certain traditions in medical school I think are still very valuable and very meaningful not to drop entirely. So I think, I'm a believer in mixed approaches to everything, not only technological, I should say, or not only, conventional. I think it's that sweet spot between modern and traditional is, I think, really good for everybody.
Yeah, you know what I remember is the last time we had the PEDS 2040 conference, and we have our youth young innovators workshop there. And the last time was with Microsoft, and they had an app that you would use in virtual reality for a heart, and you could see all parts of the heart and zoom in and zoom out and do things. It was really, really cool to see that and to play with it. Yeah,
I think we're building some tools now that you can actually be a red blood cell and you can actually travel through the heart with different heart defects, which is so amazing. I mean, what got me into pediatric cardiology in the first place was hearing a talk by a cardiologist talking about all these congenital heart defects. Back then, we only had angiograms, believe it or not. We didn't even have ultrasound. And that got me hooked immediately. And I changed my direction. I think we talked about this before. I originally was studying to be an architect. And pediatric cardiology, one talk by a pediatric cardiologist changed my career. In a way, it's kind of like Mother Nature's architecture, right? So this space and dimension love that I have was satisfied in a different way. And yes, I could have been an architect also, but and I might still do that later in my life. But just dealing with kids and being in a position to help save lives is just that gratification is so much more than I think I would have gotten as an architect. With all due respect to architects, because they do wonderful work, but I think that saving a kid's life aspect of the job, of the career, I should say, is just beyond words in terms of gratification.
So speaking of careers, Sebastian had a question for you. I'm considering a degree in public health and was curious about your thoughts on pros and cons of the degree.
Yeah. I have a public health background, global health specifically, and I think it's a wonderful addition to your career, or if you just want to pursue it as a career with a public health background. I think realistically, it's harder to do public health if you are coming in as a pure public health person in terms of getting a job, getting funding. But if you happen to have a medical degree and a public health background, that is very synergistic. And I know it doesn't sound right, doesn't sound fair. I'm just telling you the real world picture. It's hard to get funding when you just have a master of public health, even though that's a tremendous degree. You almost have to have either a clinician partner or you have to be a clinician yourself to really, I think, you will find it much easier to get funding, get jobs, to have both. So having the MPH alone, I have a lot of MPH friends who are having trouble getting jobs, but I don't have a clinician friend with an MPH that has difficulty finding a job. So I know it doesn't sound fair. You should be able to get a good job with a master in public health, but it's just really hard out there to get a job that can sustain yourself or doesn't require a lot of traveling or both. So if you think about public health, which I think a lot of people are turned on by public health these days, I think one thing to consider is maybe do it in conjunction with a medical degree, because it's just easier to find a job and easier to get funding for projects with that combination than to go at it alone with just an MPH, even though that's a very well-respected degree. Let's see, pros and cons about the degree itself. I think it gives you a global perspective. It gives you an understanding of social determinants of health and public health and how important that is. One of my research projects is working on a real-time way to measure health in a region. So that's a fun project for me in terms of tying together my interest in artificial intelligence and public health. So when you kind of tie together 2 or 3 different concepts like we've been talking about is what I find particularly interesting. Because typically public health doesn't really have a lot of data science until recently with the pandemic. And we really should be using artificial intelligence in a big way in public health. Not surprised, Karen, because I think people that are interested in multiple areas just tend to be a little bit more creative in my mind. Yes, I totally agree that one of the talks I give sometimes is called the overview effect, which is I don't know if you've heard of it. It's the sort of the cognitive shift or the change in mindset that astronauts get when they come back to the planet from their outer space travel, because you're looking at the planet from another perspective, which very few people have. And it's almost like a spiritual experience to be able to do that. And I think when you go into other areas that traditionally healthcare people don't go into, I think you can bring something really wonderful back. And it's like a gift to healthcare, your personal gift to healthcare. So I'm a firm believer in what Karen's saying, which is, think of going out of healthcare to bring back something to healthcare and make it a richer environment. I think and one of the things I really will stress on for the medical school curriculum of the future is that people have enough time to go into other areas that they typically don't have to. My niece is in medical school at in the East, and she got into the early decision program, so she can pick and choose any class she would like. And she's taking all these amazing courses like Eastern religion and, global health. And I think she is taking a design thinking class as well. So I think all of those areas are sorely lacking in healthcare. And I think it's just nice that she's getting a very, very broad education to bring it back to healthcare. We definitely need more diversity in all regards in medicine, not just gender, sexual preference, religious, but also diversity in our training and education.
And that was terrific. We appreciate you, Dr. Chang, and being here today this morning to help guide the conversation and to really explain further to all the questions that the kids have had. And Karen, thank you. That was so helpful and exciting to hear your perspectives as well. Leanne, do you want to add anything as we start to wrap up today?
Just love the conversation. I think it's been really interesting to learn about the various topics that we talked about. I love that Juliana had so many fabulous questions.
It's
so
amazing, yeah.
Getting today.
I had questions I had to think about how to answer.
Yeah, they were great.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Juliana.
So we, thank you.
And Sebastian.
Yeah.
And thank you for answering them.
Okay. Yeah, it's harder to come up with the questions than answer the questions. So thank you for that. And Sebastian too, and everyone else that asked the question.
Yep. So it's great. So I think this probably concludes our Ask the Experts for today, but we will do this again next month. So come with more questions for Anthony. I know that we next month have a guest from DuPont where they make a polymer that goes around pills that you might have to take certain medications. And so we've got a hands-on experiment with them next month. And you're going to get something in the mail if you sign up, so you can do the experiment at home while she explains what's happening to you through Zoom. So I think it should be really cool and fun.
Where do I sign up at?
You can sign up on our website.
And Juliana, you're already signed up. So I've checked on the list and your name is on there. So you'll be receiving the kit in the next couple of weeks. Watch for your mail and you'll have a surprise coming.
That's right.
Okay.
And also for all the kids, don't do the experiment at home. Save it for when we come together on Ask the Experts. So yeah, it's going to be tempting, but don't open it up and start doing it until we get together next month.
And we'll make sure you get one too, Anthony, so you can do it along with her as well.
Yes, that'll be fun. I can be a kid again. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I come again too? I don't need the kit though.
Yes,
cool.
And for anyone who wants to join in without the kit, that's fine too, because we are closing registration for being able to send it out since we need mailing time. So, pass along to anyone who, if you have friends or other kids from your chapters, if they want to join in, but they didn't get the kit, that's fine. They can still participate in our session.
Yep.
Where do you go to sign up for the video games? I know that you have to sign up at the iCAN website, but I don't know where to go to sign up.
You know what I will do, Juliana? I will send you an email after this is over to your mom, and then I will include the link for it, and she can help you look at this and see if it's something you can do. with your family if they think it's okay, and make sure you can get started that way. All right.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Have a good weekend, everybody.
Thank you. You too.
This was
Bye.
thrilling. Thank you.